You can start.
Okay. So good morning, everyone, and distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen. And I know it's a bit early, but it's so good to have you here. And thank you for joining us for the briefing. And let me also thank you to our panelists from Ecuador and Barbados, and they will share their thoughts and interest in this topic of resilient and sustainable supply chains with us. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to this third session of the Trade Policy Dialogue series in the run-up to the MC13. The 13th Ministerial Conference of WTO is around the corner. As we all know, various countries have asked us to provide a platform to discuss and assess the development implications of certain issues currently negotiated in the context of the conference and also current events that may shape the conference. So following informal consultation, we decided to organize 3 dialogues, and you were there for the last week's first session on SPS and technical barriers to trade. And the second one was on the 2nd February. We discussed the critical issues on the trade and environment nexus. And today is the last session of this series. And here we will discuss trade and supply chain resilience, or lack of it right now. So now on to the topic. Unfortunately, recent developments have reminded us of the importance of our meaning the importance of resilient supply chains. I think while some of us might have thought that after the COVID-19 pandemic, we could relax our vigilance, international supply chains have continued to face new challenges. Traffic through the Panama Canal is down by almost 2/3 compared to 2 years ago. This is because of a shortage of fresh water resulting from climate change. Grain and oil shipments travel record distances as a consequence of the war in Ukraine. And with the crisis in the Red Sea that just erupted, some weeks ago, months ago, many ships today bypass the Suez Canal, leading to longer journeys, higher freight rates, and more greenhouse gas emissions. And the most recent surges in shipping prices have been even faster than during COVID, and this is a real concern. The weekly increase in container rates as end of December was the highest surge ever recorded in a single week. Although we are not yet back to the historically high freight rates of 2022, the average container shipping spot rates, these are from the Shanghai spot rates, have already more than doubled since early December. So, ladies and gentlemen, supply chain disruptions are unfortunately becoming the new normal. I know sometimes new normal sounds like a cliche, but this is really the new normal, and it's a bit scary. As you know, maritime transport underpins world economic interdependency and global supply chain linkages. Why? Because shipping and ports handle over 80% of global merchandise trade volumes. As global supply chains have been ever deeply shaken by a succession of these disruptions, the resilience imperative has become core to this new normal. In addition to this crisis I mentioned at the outset, the sector is also facing growing cybersecurity threats, demands arising from accelerated energy transition and decarbonization imperatives, and all these developments are adding pressure to the sector and adding pressure to the supply chain functioning. And at the end of the day, the cost increases, and those increases are just passed on to you and I, the consumers. So UNCTAD is here to support to build sustainable and resilient supply chains. Our technical cooperation builds capacity of countries to tackle the challenges, some of the challenges I discussed, and we have been in the forefront actively analyzing the impact of these disruptions and building awareness about their potential implications. We are at present collaborating with IMO, International Maritime Organization, to conduct a comprehensive impact assessment of the measures aimed at decarbonizing shipping. Our technical assistance covers customs automation, port reforms, trade facilitation, e-commerce, and maritime transport, and they are all to build efficiency and resilience in the supply chains. So, although supply chains in themselves are not a specific topic of negotiation at the WTO, delegates have expressed keen interest in the topic as it cuts across many issues that are being discussed at the WTO and at the current, these are front burner issues that you may need to be aware as you go into negotiation sessions. Now, trading services under GATS could include maritime transport services, and WTO trade facilitation agreement, in fact, shows how important trade facilitation and digitalization for supply chain efficiency. And it shows how important at this moment. And in general, a stable multilateral framework will encourage much needed investments in these sectors. So this session today responds to the interest expressed by member states to share our insights, UNCTAD's insights, our member states' insights into recent development in global supply chains. So let me say we have two amazing panelists, Ms. Shani Griffith-Jack, the first Secretary of the Permanent Mission of Barbados to the United Nations Office and other international organizations. And we have Mr. Carlos Guevara, Counselor, Mission of Ecuador to the WTO and Chair of the WTO Committee on Trade Facilitation. So you will really hear from them the perspective as you go into negotiations. And so thank you for joining our session. And then after their intervention, we will have my colleague Jan Hoffman, who leads the trade logistics branch of UNCTAD, and we will hear from him about trends and developments in international supply chains. So we can start with the member states' perspectives. I don't know whether Shani is here. I cannot see her on the screen. Can we then start with Carlos? Carlos, you have the floor.
Now you can hear me now. Okay, perfect. First of all, I would like to express my gratitude to UNCTAD for the kind invitation to participate in today's dialogue. It is a real pleasure to join you today and share some of my views on this morning's increasingly important and urgent topic of building resilient and sustainable supply chains. I have been Ecuador's delegate to the Trade Facilitation Committee and other WTO committees for over 4 years now, and I have been chair of the Trade Facilitation Committee for over 8 months. And in that position, and in my broader work at the WTO, I have experienced discussions on global supply chains through several angles. And in fact, last November, the Committee on Market Access held the first of a series of thematic sessions on supply chain resilience. Interestingly enough, the objective of the introductory session was to improve our understanding, or common understanding, of what is meant by supply chain resilience, so that the committee could develop a conceptual framework for their work within the Market Access Committee. I believe that this is a vital first step, not just for that particular committee, but on a broader aspect, we need to build a global basis for all actors in supply chains. Those of us working in the multilateral trading system can see that working in silos, and by this I mean focusing only on one aspect of trade, has not been the best approach. And we tend to follow a path where we focus our attention on one single element, and yet we have proven time and time again that we cannot find long-term solutions if we stare at one tree and forget about the forest. We need to keep all the relevant elements at sight. Ongoing dialogue, such as the one we're having this morning, is extremely valuable for enhancing our understanding of the various challenges being faced along the supply chains and working together to address them. And this morning, I would like to address specifically one of the questions posed for this discussion. And this is, what could and should policymakers do to ensure sustainable and resilient supply chains? And I would like to address this question from my perspective as chair of the Trade Facilitation Committee. In a short answer, I would like to suggest that policymakers make every effort to ensure a robust implementation of the TF agreement. The COVID-19 pandemic underlined how trade facilitation and economic resilience are strongly linked. Throughout the pandemic, trade facilitation played a vital role in keeping trade in food and other essential supplies flowing. As a multilateral agreement that aims to simplify and streamline customs procedures, reduce trade barriers, and improve efficiency in the movement of goods across borders, the Trade Facilitation Agreement provides predictability, simplicity, and uniformity in customs and other border procedures. I believe that the agreement's mandate contains the regulatory infrastructure to support global supply chains. And I would like to highlight a number of reasons why. The first one, transparent and predictable trade rules. The Trade Facilitation Agreement promotes transparency and predictability in trade rules by requiring member countries to publish information on trade regulations, procedures, and fees. Transparent and predictable trade rules reduce uncertainty and enable businesses to plan and adapt their supply chains more effectively. Second, customs procedures streamlining. The Trade Facilitation Agreement requires member countries to implement measures that simplify and harmonize customs procedures, including the use of electronic documentation and pre-arrival processing. The streamlined procedures reduce delays and administrative burdens, making supply chains more efficient and resilient. Third, trade facilitation measures. The TFA encourages member countries to implement trade facilitation measures, such as the establishment of single window systems, which allow for the electronic submission and processing of trade-related documents. It promotes closer consultation with supply chain participants and greater border agency cooperation with third countries. And it supports the use of risk management, post-clearance audit, and authorized operators programs, which can help customs and other border agencies to achieve better balance between their facilitation and security functions. Fourth, cooperation and collaboration. The TFA promotes border agency cooperation, and it also promotes cooperation between members, including the exchange of information and best practices among customs. This facilitates the sharing of knowledge and experiences in trade facilitation, leading to the adoption of more effective and sustainable supply chain practices. Fifth, capacity building and technical assistance. This is a fundamental element to building sustainable and resilient supply chains to ensure that all WTO members are in a position to fully avail themselves of the benefits of this multilateral agreement. In the case of the TFA, this is reflected in the provisions on capacity building and technical assistance for developing and least developed countries to effectively implement the agreement. WTO members, as well as other international organizations, donors, and development agencies, are working hard to provide the necessary assistance and support. The current global rate of implementation commitment is at 79%. And it's a welcome and encouraging situation. However, the lower rates of implementation of developing and least developed countries is about 72%. And specifically, least developed country members, the implementation rate is around 46%. This underlines the significant challenges that these countries face. It is important that implementation challenges faced by these members and landlocked developing countries are addressed in an effective manner. Development partners, international agencies, and AGOs must work alongside. these members, the LDCs, developing members, and each other to build capacity, improve connectivity, and strengthen trade-related infrastructure. By providing support in areas such as customs procedures, infrastructure development, and institutional capacity building, the TFA helps these countries to build resilient and sustainable supply chains. Finally, I think it is important to mention the key role of the National Trade Facilitation Committees. Many WTO members at all levels of development have an operational National Trade Facilitation Committee, or NTFC. A key responsibility of NTFC is to institutionalize domestic coordination among all customs-related agencies and stakeholders. An NTFC is the best mechanism to ensure communication, coordination, and automation of border processes. As such, the role of an NTFC is to ensure a whole-of-government approach to the implementation of the TFA. This also has a very important role with regard to my previous point of capacity building and technical assistance in making sure that all agencies are seeking and finding the implementation support that they need from development partners so they are on track and they can meet implementation dates notified to the agreement. And if not, they should take the necessary steps and actions to fill these gaps. Overall, through this role, the NTFC can have a positive impact on the sustainability of supply chains. Regarding the work of the Trade Facilitation Committee at the WTO, I would like to mention that the committee produced in December 2021 a compendium of WTO members' self-reported trade facilitating measures taken during the COVID-19 crisis. In 2023, the committee produced a summary of this compendium, highlighting the main TFA-related measures that members have implemented with a positive effect. Both of these documents were in response to the 12th Ministerial Conference, where WTO members affirmed the need to review the challenges experienced and build on the lessons learned during the COVID-19 pandemic. Alongside the ongoing work of the committee in 2023, we have 3 dedicated informal sessions to provide opportunities for the TF committee to hear from WTO members, technical experts, NGOs, and private sector donors about the challenges of moving humanitarian goods across international borders during natural disasters or other emergencies. This was with a view to looking at how the lessons learned from the recent COVID-19 crisis could be utilized to better address trade facilitation issues faced by countries affected by emergencies and disasters. Across the informal sessions, 4 key areas for resilient supply chains in such circumstances were identified. First, the simplification of clearance procedures. Second, border agency coordination. Third, clear communication to traders and interested parties. And fourth, digitalization. As we have learned from the pandemic, these trade facilitating principles are most effective if they have already been established and are in place in advance of any unforeseen emergency situation. One of the important challenges we face moving on from the pandemic is not only to build back, but build back better. And this is certainly the case for ensuring sustainable and resilient supply chains. Before concluding, I would like to share with you some figures that indicate the positive impact that implementation of the TFA has already had during the first 2 years of implementation. Based on estimates for the years 2017 and 2019, WTO economists attribute to the TFA a $231 billion increase in trade, with an average 5% increase in global agricultural trade, 1.5% increase in manufacturing trade, and 1.17% increase in total trade. The increases were largely driven by the trade growth in these developed country members, where agricultural exports rose by 17%, manufacturing exports by 3.1%, and total exports by 2.4% under the TFA. In addition to these figures, examples from the pandemic have shown how implementation of the TFA has a positive impact in responding effectively to unexpected events, promoting economic recovery, enhancing the resilience and safety of supply chains. Thank you very much. I will stop here and I'll be happy to answer any questions. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Carlos, and thank you. I mean, really, I must say I learned a lot. Huh? Thank you so much from bringing the insights of your own work and your work as the chair of the WTO Committee on TFA, Trade Facilitation, and the discussions in the committee and how much you have discussed about the resilience to supply chains and the connection to trade facilitation. And I think that connection is extremely important. And if I'm not presumptuous, I must also say, I think everybody who is going to the negotiations need to read your speech that you gave to us today. So please also share it with the WTO, the committee. I think it will be a great service. Thank you so much. And I will read it and learn more from you, Carlos. Thank you. So let me now invite His Excellency Matthew Wilson, our Ambassador of Barbados. Matthew, you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Shamika, and good morning to everyone. I am a last-minute addition to this panel because my deputy, Ashani, who was supposed to join, unfortunately had another meeting. So I will not be as expansive and probably as wise as Carlos. But I'm here really just to say why this issue of supply chains is so extremely important to small island developing states and vulnerable countries like Barbados. During the pandemic, we saw what short supply chains meant. During the pandemic, we saw what happens when you don't have agency over the supply chains, when you are a policy taker, when you are a price taker, when you are a product taker. We saw this because we didn't have access to the vaccines that we needed. We didn't have access to the PPE materials that we needed. There was a huge impact on our food security, and hence our import bill went through the roof. And this is all because the vulnerable countries are often at the tail end of these supply chains. And this is why having a specific discussion on this in UNCTAD, having a specific discussion on this in WTO as well, is so critically important. And here, I'm really happy to see that in the lead up to the WTO Ministerial, which is in less than 2 weeks, in the draft outcome document for ministers, there's actually a paragraph on supply chains. And I think that this shows the increasing recognition that at the global level, we need to look at the implications of weak supply chains, of nearshoring, of friendshoring on small vulnerable economies and least developed countries as well. For Barbados, we feel that we have been slightly ahead of the curve because coming out of UNCTAD 15, which we hosted, Prime Minister Motley specifically asked UNCTAD SG Rebecca Greenspan, can we do something together on looking at supply chains? And I'm so delighted with the way that UNCTAD reacted so quickly, so effectively to this call from my Prime Minister. And in a few months, in May, to be exact, May 21st to 24th, I believe, we're going to be having the first UNCTAD Global Supply Chain Forum in Barbados, in beautiful Barbados. So this also shows that UNCTAD listens. And that for me is such an important message that you're sending. And this UNCTAD Supply Chain Forum will look at everything from agriculture and food security to trade facilitation, to port infrastructure, to finance, to women maritime, to decarbonization, to shipping. And these are all critical elements of making sure that supply chains are robust as we move forward. There, we have to have a discussion on what the problems are. We have to have a discussion on the constraints that we face. But more importantly, we need to start looking at some clear solutions because small countries cannot be cut off from international trade because we are at the back of the line of, excuse me, of reaching supply chains. So I'm really, really delighted that we are going to be having this discussion, because supply chains also matter to extremely contemporary issues that we're grappling with right now, like climate change. So on the one hand, we're told you have to embrace the green transition. And to do that, you have to have access to technology, you have to have access to inputs. We are having great difficulty accessing the inputs that we need to be able to invest in the circular economy, because the supply chains do not reach us. Because we are, like I said, we don't produce, we have to import, we have to depend on those who are producing and exporting. We have to depend on the supply chains reaching us, and that's not happening. So if you want small countries to be able to invest in green transition, and for our micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises to be able to embrace the circular economy, you have to ensure that the supply chains are transparent and robust enough to be able to reach all of us in the Caribbean, in the Pacific, in Central America, and in Africa, and especially the LDCs. So when you look at what is happening right now in the Red Sea, when you're looking at what has been happening in the Panama Canal, two different reasons for it. One is climate change related, and one is because of geopolitics and geopolitical tensions. But the impact on small economies is exactly the same. Exactly the same. It exacerbates our vulnerability. It exacerbates the price of our imports. It exacerbates our food insecurity. So I think that there's really a need to place a spotlight on what these different realities mean for countries who are grappling with not just economic transformation, but also climate-related transition. So this is a very, very simple enumeration of the issues that we're facing. A simple call for all of those on the line to come to Barbados in May to discuss these issues, to put your concerns and your solutions front and center on the table, for us to really break bread and try to find solutions to what I think is a incredibly critical matter that we have to deal with if we're all going to meet the sustainable development goals. So thank you very much, Shamika and Jan, for having Barbados here. And I'm afraid I can't stay much longer. I have some competing meetings, but I really wanted to be here to show why this is such an important issue for us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and it is so good to have you here. And thank you so much for making a very passionate case for SIDS. And as you said, this is what we see at end of every crisis. The brunt is borne by SIDS, by LDCs, and this is it. And it is a big concern. And as you said, we are very happy to host the Global Supply Chain Forum with Barbados. And I think this is just a visionary thinking from the Prime Minister at the UNCTAD 15. And you know, we thought, okay, COVID-19 was it, but it is not the case. And the supply chain disruptions are going to be the new normal. And the end of all that disruptions are the most vulnerable countries, and suffering from the food insecurity, suffering from the massive inflation, suffering from the massive economic crisis, the debt crisis, and you know, they all roll into one. So thank you so much for being here with us. And also, I also would like to invite everyone to gather in Barbados, in Bridgetown, in May 21 to 24. We really need to have a conversation, a serious conversation. We really need to have a hash out, a plan of action, because we cannot continue living in this totally uncertain and scary series of supply chain disruptions. So thank you so much for being with us, and thank you very much for joining at the last minute and still making this passionate plea for the SIDS. Thank you, Matthew. So let me now move on to Jan Hoffman. I mean, you all know Jan. Jan Hoffman is he leads the trade logistics work of UNCTAD, and he will give us the numbers, and he will tell us, you know, what an emergency or urgent situation that we are in right now with regard to supply chain resilience. Jan, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Shamika. Thank you, Carlos and Matthew. I also want to thank the DITC colleagues here because this series of briefings is organized under the UNCTAD working groups for the WTO, led by Miho and the trade division colleagues. So thank you for all this. I will go straight to the point and start sharing my screen. I hope you can now all see the screen that says 11th UNCTAD Trade Policy Dialogue. If not, please let me know. Otherwise, I will start. The story so far, you imagine a James Bond movie where you first have to go through half an hour of preliminaries like a car chase and so on. But it's important to see what has happened, what's the long-term trends in supply chains. I have 4 key long-term trends that overall illustrate improvements over the decades in increased participation of developing countries in supply chain. No longer just providers of raw materials, as you can see here in the chart in the 1970s, the participation of developing countries there were high volume but low value.
Jan, can I interrupt, Jan? I
please.
don't see your charts.
Okay, sorry.
I see the backgrounds.
Okay, thank you for the warning. This is very important. This is very strange because I did. It tells it is working, and we tested it before. Thank you for the warning.
No problem.
Okay. Share. Can you see it now?
Yeah, all good.
Okay, thank you. I don't know. We continue. Now you see the red bar and the blue bar, and you do see really this very, very different geography of trade where developing countries, including, thank you also Remy for warning me, including, of course, China and all developing countries, but a very different, overall positive trend, this participation of developing countries. Second long-term trend is supply chains are ever more globalized. Hard data here. The typical distance traveled of a typical ton of shipped cargo had been going up. A third positive trend, there we have many data, and Carlos referred to some good numbers. Logistics services have improved. For example, the declining share of money we spend on inventory holding, which is to some extent an inefficiency, waiting times at borders, warehousing, interest rate depreciation. And a fourth positive trend is this long-term decline in the time ships spent in port, even though ships get bigger and load and unload more containers. So that's hard data. We will share the PowerPoint, but a lot of positive long-term trends. And then came COVID, and freight rates went through the roof. Please note here on the y-axis, really it's not cheating. It's really a 5-fold, 7-fold, 9-fold increase of different shipping costs. What happened was really that demand increased. We were sitting at home, ordering more things online, and the real capacity to deliver declined. And because of the very specific supply and demand dynamics in transport, especially in shipping, happy to give a 90-minute lecture on this topic, but I hope it is clear. This is, for me, a very concise and comprehensive explanation of what we really saw in COVID, this mismatch, demand increasing, supply decreasing. And because of the type of technology we have this huge surge in freight rates. So then what did this mean? And we are very proud, we simulated and forecasted early on when the freight rates started to go up, we said this will have an impact on prices. And it did. We forecasted 1.5 percentage points, later on updated 1.6 globally, with even worse impact. You see on the right for the SIDS, for the small island developing states, least developed countries. They were even more negatively affected by these higher shipping costs. And this was later confirmed by the IMF, the International Monetary Fund said, UNCTAD, you were right. what are the products that are most strongly affected? And this I find particularly interesting here, supply chains, every country's trade. We said increase 1.5% average globally. Some products were much more affected. The one here that I've put in the red box, the one that says furniture, other manufacturing. This is very cheap furniture. Think of white plastic garden furniture, a container full of cheap stuff. When then the container freight rate goes up from $5,000 to $25,000, it does have an impact on the price of the goods in the shop. The top one is crucial. It shows deep supply chains. It shows that before a high value good, where the container may be worth $1 million of high value cameras, medical equipment, and so on. But before my dear Nikon camera is put into the container, the plastic tab and the bag and the chip and all the components have been moved up to 9 times in the container. So it accumulates. So the inefficiencies and what we see when all of a sudden IKEA, others say, oh, I'm short of things. It's not necessarily the final product, but it's the production. So this is really what happened. Now we are back. I mean, freight rates went down again for some time. And we did see during the crisis, for the first time since we look at this, that the participation of developing countries in volumes unloaded for the first time slightly decreased. Bad news. Then the latest data we are back to the positive trajectory. So we thought until recently we might be back to where we were before. Same with the logistics, the efficiency. We had huge inefficiencies. A surge in expenditure on inventory holding, more waiting times, many bad things. We thought we would now go back to a positive trend because there has been also a lot of investment in trade station. I think Carlos would agree that we have also the UN survey. Overall, slowly but slowly, there's more investment in customs automation, pre-arrival processing, single windows. A lot of these solutions were motivated by the challenges. And the distances went actually down. Many different explanations there. They are going up again, and I'll come back to this. And the fourth trend I shared with you, the waiting times in ports, really bad, particularly in the developed countries. The long-term trend, the long-term was that the developed countries' ports are more efficient on average. The orange line is below the blue line. During these really congestion in the US and Europe, they were even worse off. So now that we are back going in the positive direction. So I said it's like the James Bond movie. We had that story so far. Now we come to where are we now? Choke points. Shamika referred to it. What has been much in the news is the Red Sea crisis. So you see a decline of 40–50%. It depends a bit what exactly you count, if tons or transits and so on. But these are the total transits. The blue line, you see the monthly decrease. If we had weekly data, it would be even worse. Look also at the red line. It's not over 2 months, but over a bit more than 2 years. But the decline of transits through the Panama Canal is almost just as bad. So this then leads to a further surge in the distances. Now, one could argue that longer distances is a positive sign showing how we are trading globally, but it also means more costs, more ton miles. Fascinating story. It could be for another 3 briefings about the geography of trade. But the one I've put here in the circle, the container, had a decrease long term, but now with ships going around South Africa, the latest estimates forecasts are again an increase. And freight rates are rising again. Will they rise further? No, it's not going to be as bad, as strong as the COVID crisis. It is particularly affecting trade between going through the Suez Canal. The other routes are not that much affected. It's not as strong, yes, as before, but still, it's just a reminder, as Shamika said in the introduction, it's a reminder supply chain need to be resilient. So what can the WTO do? What instruments are at the WTO? And let me just share one slide, which is, I hope is not too technical, but it's from a comprehensive study on building resilience. Building resilience has to do with diversifying, with introducing options, possibilities, flexibilities. So there are 8 specific words here illustrated by Professor Jean-Paul Rodriguez, which one could again spend a long time explaining this, but I hope you get the gist that overall between high resilience and low resilience, high resilience is whenever you have stability, predictability, more options, more choices, not so deep supply chains and so on. And here is where the WTO can come in. As Shamika said, there's no specific, and Carlos, Matthew, there's no specific WTO instrument on supply chains or on resilience, but you, the delegates, you are matter, you are important, you do matter. Our favorite, a lot of our work, the trade facilitation agreement, Carlos explained it very well. It helps achieve smooth operations of international supply chains. But there are also the agreement on technical barriers to trade and the agreement on the SPS agreement. They help the shippers, the traders, navigate the regulatory environment in different countries. So this is very important. Without this type of agreement, supply chains could not be as global and deep. One that I personally feel quite strong about is trade in services. Some things can be done at the WTO, a lot can be done bilaterally and regional agreements. Markets in transport services can significantly help increase resilience. Just think of many examples where trucks go full one way and have to come back empty the other way because of non-existent agreements of transport markets. Dispute settlement mechanism is also important. That's really core to the WTO. It is a central element to provide certainty and predictability. And of course, the trade policy review mechanisms also help to increase transparency and adherence to the WTO agreements. So I'm trying here, thinking aloud, although there's no specific WTO instrument on resilient supply chains, the WTO members and secretariat have over the last few years reached out on many issues. We have participated, contributed, jointly worked on impacts for this small and vulnerable economies, on markets, on trade facilitation, of course. So I think it's good to look into it. It's correct to say, well, there's not that much I can do directly, but a functioning, strong WTO multilateral system also helps support supply chain resilience. One specific example, which Carlos, I hope you will like. So here we correlated, and I am aware that all those people who confuse correlation and causality will eventually die, but I do see there is some causality here. We do believe that those countries who have implemented electronic payment, risk management, authorized economic operators, border agency cooperation, they have statistically also better port performance. And there is all types of causalities, but we do think some of the causalities does go from the improved trade facilitation to the improved port performance. Last slide, please join us in Barbados. Matthew alluded to it. We are impressive, amazing. We are very proud about the feedback already received. So don't say you didn't know. It's taking place in about 100 days. And we are finalizing agenda, speakers. It's looking very impressive. The link is down there. Reach out to us. We are still open to partners, to sponsors, to some speaking slots, but it's filling up very quickly. So I will stop sharing screen here. And I saw we had already a few questions in the Q&A. I'm not sure if Shamika, you can see the questions that are in the Q&A. Or yeah. and open to
Yeah,
questions.
thank you so much, Jan, and thank you for taking us through this really current numbers of what's going on when we talk about the supply chain disruptions, when you talk about how important the resilience is, and when you talk about the developing countries, especially the more vulnerable countries, are at the receiving end of all these repercussions. And it is always good to see these with numbers, because otherwise they are just stuff that we say. So thank you for for the colleagues in my division to come together and put together this massive data analysis for our delegates. I think these are important points as you go for negotiations. And I think, as all of you said, yes, there is nothing called negotiating on resilience, but I think this situation of supply chain resilience, it cuts across many negotiation positions. I'm very happy there's already a paragraph highlighting the importance of this issue. And I think it's good to be aware of this situation, and they are not one-shot events. And they, as I said, this is the new normal, and it is not going away. We all thought, okay, COVID-19 came and it went back to normal on supply chain resilience. It's not going to be the case, unfortunately. It's going to be massive disruptions are coming our way, and they're all coming together, different things, geopolitical issues, climate change issues, as also Matthew highlighted. So I think now we are at the end of the presentation mode. I have a question here, Jan. Do you want me to, maybe Carlos and Jan, I will read a couple of these things. I think one of the questions, anyway, probably it captures everything. You probably will spend the rest of your time answering that. So one of the questions is, in terms of ensuring that everyone complies to agreed TFA measures, what can be done to make sure that supply chain resilience is done in a way that it fairly benefits all global trade players? Because there is little point in implementing measures if they have no benefits at all. And I think this is a very valid point. Carlos, I start with you, and then Jan, and maybe I will also add a sentence or two. So please, Carlos, you have the floor.
Thank you, Shamika. And it is a very good question. And I read it's also the comments before. And I think one point that we need to emphasize here is what Jan mentioned. We don't have an agreement on supply chains at the WTO. So what we are trying to do is to use the existing rules to face the challenges that are emerging now. So TFA is not the solution for all the issues, right? So yes, the situation is much more complex. I totally agree. But what we're trying to do is to use the elements, in this case TFA, but there are others that we need to combine. And that's why I mentioned during my intervention that there is an ongoing conversation at the WTO in market access. Now we have in the draft of the outcome document, there is a paragraph on supply chains. So this is much more complex, and we need to do more work to fully understand what are the tools that we have at hand and what can be done. And regarding the benefits, I tried to point out at the end of my intervention as well some of the benefits of implementing the TFA. So you see that it's not, the efforts are not in vain, that there is a benefit on implementing these agreement, the provisions of the agreement. And basically this is translated to an increase in participation in trade, in international trade. Now, if we want to enhance this participation, we need to pay close attention to the supply chains, to the supply chain resilience. And therefore, that's where we see the TFA supporting the work that needs to be done. Again, it doesn't have all the answers, but it supports specific angles and specific sectors of work that are needed for supply chain. And finally, I think I'll just want to emphasize as well that from the conversation we had at the committee, we see that a country is better prepared to face any sort of crisis or unexpected situations if they have these provisions in place beforehand. Because if you don't, it's even harder to implement these provisions in situations that are high pressure, or you're facing a crisis like the pandemic. So that's why it is also important to take into account that we need to keep working to implementing the provisions. And for that, each member needs to identify what the priorities are, what are the sectors that they need to work the most on. So what they are doing has a response to the areas of interest and the priorities that they have as a country. So I just want to mention that. I think there are many benefits on the agreement, and it's important also to do the internal work so the priorities are set clearly. So that will be the guidance for the work that needs to be done. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Let me also add to what you said. In this supply chain crisis that's brewing in front of us, we didn't even go into talking about the reshoring, friendshoring, nearshoring, whether the developing countries will be totally out of supply chain, global value chains. And, that's how a lot of countries have developed their economies. What will happen? And in this new emerging world, we haven't even gone there. So one of the things is that, as Matthew said, and I think also you said, developing countries are price takers, policy takers. There are many, not the big ones, the many small islands and the many LDCs. So that's the reality. And there are things that we can do on our own. And I must say that the TFA has really set the stage for increasing efficiency and reducing red tape. And by doing that and showing to the value chains owners that there are countries where things can get, the goods can move fast. The red tape is much less. Doing international trade is less costly. And these countries will have an opportunity to keep their engagement with global value chains. So this is why trade facilitation agreements and the measures are so important, because many things can be done and much of the trade cost can be reduced by countries engaging in this. But then I also want to say, Carlos, I think at one point you mentioned in your speech how important the capacity building. And you mentioned about the LDCs, the low rate of implementation of TFA, the immense capacity building needs. I also want to put give a shout out to development partners, because the trade facilitation is not the most fashionable area, that get attention when it comes to development assistance. It doesn't hit. There's no red tape. There's no that's not fanfare when there you have a customs automation program is done. And, there are no buildings to put flags and all that kind of stuff. So it doesn't get attention, that area. It's basically, we say it's the plumbing of the international trading system. I mean, a lot of people are not interested in plumbing. Plumbing is something you do underneath. Nobody sees the value of plumbing. But I must say, the development partners also need to pay a lot of attention to building capacity building, technical, assistance for digitization, for these massive programs that the developing countries do, as you mentioned about the single window development, the customs automation, other capacity building activities around the NTFCs. And these are all worthy, and these are all extremely important when we are in a supply chain flux. So just also want to add to what you said. Thank you so much, Carlos. Jan, you have the floor.
Yeah, no, I really don't have anything to add. You've said it all, you and Carlos. I see there are 2-3 additional questions about SMEs and private sector. So given that we have not so much time, I'm not sure if you said it in the agenda, it says up to 10 o'clock, but we had received some clear messages from colleagues, from participants, that you have meetings starting at 10 at the WTO. So our plan is to conclude at 9:45. And with this, I would say that there's a question about SMEs, private sector. Maybe we move to those, Shamika.
Yeah, I think so, Jan. Why don't you start with SME? What can be done to increase the participation of SMEs more in global supply chains for the sake of trade and development in developing and least developed countries? I think these are very pertinent questions. Maybe you start and we get, I don't know whether there's any other questions.
There's one in the in the Q&A about private sector, and let me start with the SME question. This is really at the core, and we, especially with TradeStation, but also the efficiency, the openness, transparency. You see the multinational big companies, they have their own offices all over the world. But if you're a smaller company and you want to trade globally, you depend even more on access to information on the internet, for example, or on transparent, clear rules. So you may not necessarily depend on agents and can do this yourself. And I know Carlos is very much aware of this, especially in the context of the TradeStation agreement, but it applies to all types of resilience market access. If you think of the the informal trade, the cross-border trade, a lot of these are women. It's also a gender issue. By facilitating the formalization of trade, by making it easier to have bank accounts and certificates, and so that, yes, at some stage, informal traders have shared with us they don't want to make their trade formal, because then they may have to pay duties or taxes. But in our view, this is development. Development is reducing the share of the informal economy, having a formal economy with insurance, with health, with unemployment, and so on and so forth. So I don't think we can quantify it, but there's a lot of good anecdotal evidence that more transparent supply chains and TradeStation also help to formalize the informal sector, and that it's not only SMEs, it's even more. But yeah, that's something on my side. I'm not sure if maybe Carlos or Shamika would like to complement this one.
Thank you, Jan. Carlos, this is the SME question. And also there is another question on what is the role of the private sector in improving national supply chain resilience. So I think the SME one, let me also say this is the private sector question was put to us by Nat Tan Panich. So thank you so much, Nat, for this very important question. And it's Jose Sanchez who asked us what can be done to increase the participation of SMEs more in global supply chains. And thank you. This is also I think we can go on for days. In fact, please come to Barbados. I think these are the issues that we will really hash out in Barbados. We will have a ministerial agreement, statements on this issue. So please, I think this is a continuation towards Barbados. So let me, Carlos, give these two questions to you in which order you want to take. Please decide.
Thanks, Shamika. Probably I will talk about the private sector first. And I think this is very important because within the context of the trade facilitation agreement, the private sector are the users of the measures that are implemented. So getting the feedback from them is crucial. And as I mentioned, the NTFCs, the National Trade Facilitation Committees, in most countries is the place where they meet, public and private sector. They work together. Most of the NTFCs have participation from the private sector. And the feedback that they provide in any case, in the TFA, and I know this question is about supply chains, but if the government or the national authorities are not aware of what's going on the ground, it's very little that can be done. So I think it's crucial to get that feedback from the private sector, the users, because when you define a public policy, a public policy is, in theory, is balanced, non-discriminatory, but when it is applied, you start to find some challenges on the ground. So I think it's a key element to get a channel of communication open, to get that feedback, so the administrators of the measures are aware of what's going on. And regarding the integration and participation of MISMEs in supply chains, I think that is something that we need to better understand and create a deeper discussion, because quite often we hear of the opportunities for developing countries to participate in supply chains. But the question is how? These supply chains have already certain quality standards, have certain requirements that need to be fulfilled if a company wants to participate in those supply chains. As Jan mentioned, and it was very interesting to see how the prices of certain products were affected by the increase of transport fees. Well, these components move from one place to another, and when they are assembled, they need to keep the same quality standards. So that is something that needs to be understood better. What are the strengths and the potentials of a country, depending on the region that it's located, or what certain value chains are operating in the geographical location that this developing member or the MISMIS is located. I think we need to understand better the dynamics and what are the requirements. And once that is identified, what needs to be done? Maybe technical assistance, capacity building, improving the business environment, because these supply chains need to rely on the local providers. They need to operate, and for that you have specific times, you have specific requirements. So I believe that this is a conversation, as you mentioned, that probably Barbados will provide more inputs in that, more clarity on that. But I believe that more work needs to be done in order to fully understand how to take advantage of these opportunities, and how you can do it, how a MISMIS, whatever they are, can be part or can be integrated in these value chains.
Thank you so much, Carlos. And me being really pragmatic. There are things we know, there are things we can do, there are things we also don't know. We really need to go deeper and understand. So Jan, you have the floor.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, two thoughts on the private sector, as Carlos rightly explained the importance and opportunities through the national trade session committees, for example. Now this briefing here is for the delegations, the negotiators, and it is true that the private sector, of course, is not directly in the room. It participates as much, and we encourage this, as advisor. So many delegations do bring chambers of commerce, associations to the negotiations, and they participate in the negotiating groups, and this is very important. We do find it challenging when we work in our empowerment program, in the reform tracker. We really find it difficult to encourage private sector to actually participate, because we have the classical public good problem. Everybody wants to benefit from the outcome, the work, the inputs of the National Trade Session Committee that promotes single windows, simplifies procedures. But while I am sitting in the room and work, my competitor is visiting my client, if I am a private sector, yeah? So if private sector is not there, we hear complaints. If we invite private sector, it's not always easy to participate. So those who are here from the private sector, please feel always invited. Second point on private sector, it comes back to this one chart I had with all these aspects of what builds resilience. Global standards are very important. And yeah, I'm a fanatic of containers. I'm so sorry. I love containers, but they're a beautiful example of how a private sector driven innovation globalized trade after it became a global standard. So you had a private sector tracking company, Mr. McLean, who had his type of box, and then there were other type of boxes, and the whole system only works if the ships and the rail and the trucks and the boxes and the warehouses, they all work with the same standard. It doesn't really matter which standard exactly, but it has to be the same. And we see the same development now in certain technologies, in data standards, in transmission standards, in all types of AI, blockchain, and so on. We do see big private companies moving, pushing, and we feel very strongly about saying, look, please ensure that we come at some point in time to an ISO and CFACT recommendations, ISO standard, which then links back to the previous one, the SMEs and the small companies. They cannot develop their own standards. They depend on global standards. The TFA itself helps standardizing certain expectations, like, okay, there are different ways how you define an advanced ruling, but by having it in the WTO, it also already became a standard. So private sector, to some extent, can see closed standards as a competitive advantage, but for the benefit of all, as much as possible, we should aim at global public standards.
Thank you, Jan. I think we have this one last, it's not so much question, I said this is a philosophical conversation of the power imbalances in the world, as we saw during COVID-19, and how countries, some countries, the big countries who had lots of money, who had the pharmaceutical companies, hoarded all the COVID-19 vaccines, and even ordered 3 times more than their populations, in some cases. Whereas the developing countries did not have access to LDCs, did not have access, but we were all going through the same COVID-19, and we all were scared of our aged parents in every country. So there's a question about this power imbalance, and yes, what can really this developing countries, the LDCs, can do, because it's not just it's not the resilience that we, the poor countries, can build. So this is a much larger issue, and for the sake of time, but I think this is an important issue. But please also check out the technology and innovation report of UNCTAD. We issued this report last year around this time, March, and where we do talk about the global challenges and the need for global solutions. And there's a whole chapter where we look at, is the multilateral system. It could be the trading system, it could be the international property rights system, it could be the climate, the climate conversation. Is the multilateral system ready to address the global calamities? Because the global challenges like the pandemics, global challenges like the climate change, they need global answers. But we believe that the multilateral system is not, these issues are about the technology transfer. These issues are a lot to do with the intellectual property rights. And we had a whole conversation in a whole chapter of how to get the multilateral system right so that the world is ready to handle global challenges. And there's a big vacuum. And some of the multilateral conversations you will be having at the MC13, because that's the international trade aspects. And that's also where the part of the technology transfer, the IPR systems conversation would come. So I also invite all of you who are going to the MC13 to pay attention. And there is a massive amount of work that we have done recently in UNCTAD, really bearing on these questions. So if Carlos and Jan would, if you want to address this big issue, please take a couple of minutes. But this is a very important issue. I'm sorry that we are, trying to wrap up this session, but keep an eye on or ear to what's going on in UNCTAD. We are revisiting these issues constantly. Carlos, you would want to take the floor, Jan?
I would just emphasize on or build on what you said. I think during the pandemic, it was one of the main concerns how we make possible that everybody around the world gets the vaccines at some point. And of course, there was an imbalance on who produced them, who had them, who didn't have them. But that's part of the discussions. And I can say that at the WTO, this was very well paid attention to, trying to make sure that all members will receive or have access to the essential goods. I think and I saw the word panic in the comment, and I think that's very important to underline, because that's what we all felt. We didn't know how to face the situation. We didn't know how to process, and everything was developing so quickly. And that's why I think it is important to build on the lessons learned during the pandemic, and knowing that And this can happen. Again, we don't want it, but we see how the world is evolving, and we need to be ready. So we don't follow in the same steps as when we were not prepared. And with these, I think it is important to use all the elements and resources and the good practices that have been identified, so we're better prepared. But definitely keeping an eye, monitoring that everybody has an equal access of goods and services when they are needed. It's part of the ongoing multilateral discussions. Yes.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Jan, would you want to take the floor, or you would want to close the meeting?
You will close the meeting. I refer to the link to the Global Supply Chain Forum that I have put in the chat. Really, a lot of these questions, and there were a couple of people who had raised their hands, and we didn't have time to have verbal input, but happy to see all these exchanges. The topic is more and more important, and I will not again interrupt my boss when she closes the meeting. Bye.
Thank you so much, Jan, and thank you so much, Carlos, for being with us and answering and taking us through these many issues, interconnected, very complicated and complex issues that we are facing today. And I hope that you got some material as you go into the MC13 negotiations, and please reflect on these larger issues. I think, Carlos, you started to say many issues are interconnected. It's not like, okay, there's one thing, the supply chain is happening here, trade facilitation is happening there, and something is going on there. No, there's a much more interconnected world that we are dealing with. And the supply chain crisis, the geopolitical issues, the climate change, and they all have merged into one thing. So my hope is, as you go into the MC13 negotiations, the serious work ahead of you, I hope that this session helped you. But please also know that there are some of these issues that you started to discuss. This cannot be discussed in 5 minutes. And we are here at UNCTAD. Carlos, if the committee, for example, wants UNCTAD to weigh in on trade facilitation issues, some aspects of it, let us know. We will always can organize such a meeting, and our experts would bring the insights and the current knowledge, the data and the facts and the evidence to you. So having said that, let me thank our participants and for being with us and asking very pertinent questions. As Jan said, some of you put your hands up and we could not manage the verbal the interactions. I'm sorry about that, but please know we are just here in Geneva and for you. So we are at your service. If you ever want to say we want to hear more on UNCTAD's insights on an issue, please do not hesitate to let us know, and we will organize such a meeting and take you through. So participants, our amazing speakers, and Matthew, who had to run at the last minute here and then run back. And thank you so much and have a great day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.